How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most certified podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of the album recap series. This time, we're going to be covering all of the major releases that we found from September of 2021. And this one is probably going to be one of our more compacted episodes, because we only have about 15 albums to talk about here instead of the normal 20. This month, it's been a bit of a weird one. There's been so many banger albums, but there's also been so many just non-essential ones. So it's been narrowed down to these 15 records, and yeah, I'm ready when you are. So will we start with the first album?
Hell yeah.
Alright, and we're starting off with probably the biggest album of the month, but not in terms of quality, because we're talking about Certified Lover Boy by Drake. This is the sixth studio album from Canadian singer, rapper, quote-unquote songwriter, and megastar Drake. Now, it's been a good while since we last heard from Drake in an album format. I know he dropped that Dark Lane Demo Tapes mixtape, which was essentially just a collection of demos, and he also dropped a few comps here and there, but his last album that was truly an album was Scorpion, which is easily one of his worst albums. I have a soft spot for some of Drake's older stuff, but everything he's dropped past that point has been just blatant filler that adds nothing new or anything unique for Drake. In fact, most of it is just playing to the same market that we saw him play for years and making radio filler. Not to mention, when the absolutely horrendous artwork dropped for it, I was just expecting it to be an utter shit show. And when I saw how long it was going to be too, I was just not arsed to listen to it. Well, of course, the grind continues. I gave it a listen, and as expected, it's just the same mediocre filler from Drake once again. Now to start with some positives, I actually like a few of the tracks on here, which are genuine bangers that have some really great production, and for the most part, the album does feel very polished and complete. But that's really it, since Drake once again does nothing to justify why this album needed to be an hour and a half long. It's made clear in the past that Drake just doesn't give a flying fuck about the quality of his own projects, and pretty much every reason as to why is front and center for the entirety of Certified Lover Boy. For one, the obvious criticism is the fact that it's just way too fucking long. It's just so bloated with unnecessary dogshit filler. The production, while polished, is just incredibly typical for Drake. It's incredibly unmemorable, and it's dull. Drake's bars range from meh to even more meh. And of course, you had to hammer in some cringe in there, because what's a Drake album without cringe? Not to mention, some of the bars and song titles on the thing are just so wrong, especially given how much of a creep Drake has proven himself to be. I could go on, but I honestly have so little to say about this album. It's just Drake doing the same thing again and creating more filler so he can get more revenue. There's no art or passion here. It's just a waste of sound, and it's a waste of your time. So, in conclusion, Donda is better.
There's no competition. Yeah, let's be honest. I mean, other than fucking Drake stands, nobody really expected this to be any good. And it certainly isn't. It's just what everyone expected from an album titled Certified Lover Boy. Just shallow, lifeless, cookie-cutter trap rap with just some seriously dodgy, to say the least, undertones. I mean, Drake is one of the least exciting rappers around. I mean, sure, he's fucking massive, and sure, about 100 million people will fucking hard disagree with me. But anyone who, in our sphere just knows that there's not much to expect from Drake, and this is just what most of us expected. It's just track after track of, as you said, filler, just lifeless nothingness. It's just trap pastiche, and Drake just fucking meanders his way through the whole project. There's just some really fucking weird tracks like Way Too Sexy, or especially fucking Fans, and it's just it leaves a bad taste in my mouth as a whole. It's not very good.
Yeah, I agree. My favourite tracks from Certified Lover Boy are Champagne Poetry and Fair Trade. The worst tracks are Way Too Sexy and Fucking Fans, and I gave this album a decent 4.
My favourite track was Champagne Poetry. My least favourite tracks are Girls Want Girls, Way Too Sexy, and Fucking Fans. And I gave this album a decent 3 out of 10.
Wait, I forgot to mention Girls Want Girls. Oh, fuck, that's long. Alright, in contrast now, the next album, though. Sometimes I Might Be Introvert by Little Simz. This is the fourth studio album from the UK rapper and lyricist Little Simz. Simz is coming out with her newest album about 2 years after her critically acclaimed third album, Grey Area, which was a great record in my opinion, and it's still a great one for me now. There's some absolute gems on that album, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who hasn't heard it. But enough about Grey Area, since we're talking about her newest album, Sometimes I Might Be Introvert, which was an album that I was very excited to hear since Grey Area was so impressive, and the singles for Simbi were very exciting, to say the least. These singles just teased at a record that had classic potential, and, you know, only time will tell if that's the case. But I strongly believe that it will attain classic status soon, because Sometimes I Might Be Introvert is an incredible album, to say the least. And this album is just stellar on so many fronts, you know, from the themes to Simz's pen game, the fantastic production, to the blends and influences, and so on. I just want to start by talking about the production, which is fantastic all over this album. It sounds immaculately produced from front to back. It's going for something that feels large and grand, while at the same time it feels varied in what it tries to achieve, given just the wave of influences that it takes from. You know, it takes from orchestral music, neo-soul, jazz rap, funk, and Afrobeat, just to name a few things. You know, all of these sounds are executed so seamlessly, and it acts as an incredibly solid backdrop to the themes that Simz herself is exploring on this album. There's nothing bad to say about Inflow's production on this thing, because, quite frankly, it's damn near flawless for me. But where the album truly stands out for me is when it comes to Simz herself, who is, you know, rapping on about some very thought-provoking and deeply personal lyrics. Her performances are electrifying, they're filled with swagger and confidence, and they're just amazing all around. You know, as the title may suggest, Simz seems to be focusing on, you know, the idea of being an introvert, but something on this LP is just speaking to me, because it's just so... it just feels so potent and poignant. It's impressive, to say the least. You know, we see her basically break away from, like, the feelings of introversion and just tackle things that she has both talked about before, as well as things that she's never really had to face before. You know, I think she's a dynamic performer, and she does this all while being so engaging. My only gripe with the album is really the interludes. I do like that they play into the themes of the album and, you know, what Simz is going over. But for me, I just don't really enjoy sitting through them. They feel a bit banal, I guess. Well, honestly, they don't totally ruin the album. They don't really halt my enjoyment of the individual tracks, and they do play to the themes of the album. But, you know, they seem like kind of odd inclusions for me, I guess. So I guess I just have to say I was blown away by what Little Simz had to offer on this album, and I was caught off guard by it, and I'm glad that I was, because I love this thing. It's definitely going to end up being on my year-end lists, and it's probably going to end up being my favourite hip-hop album of the year, so we'll have to see if something just comes out the cracks for October or November, but for now, I think this album is amazing, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was also a big fan of Grey Area, but even then, this is far beyond what my expectations could have been. You know, Little Simz has just released an album that could very well, you know, go on to become a touchstone in UK hip hop and hip hop at large. And, you know, everything that she excelled on, like on Grey Area and previous records, she just takes to new heights on this new album in just mind-blowing fashion. I'll start with the production, and I'll start by giving credit to a name that, you know, is a little overlooked in my opinion. Inflow is the producer on this thing, and holy fucking shit, they do a magnificent job. They blend UK hip hop with jazz rap, with neo soul, and then, you know, sprinkle in all these these beautiful elements throughout. It's just one of the most grandiose, awe-inspiring, and just amazing albums in terms of production I've heard in a long time. And honestly, this year in terms of hip hop, I don't know of an album that comes close to it. It really is the standard setting project for this year. It really is, you know, one of the most engaging, you know, production wise albums I've heard in a long time. And, you know, Simbi does absolutely marvelously to live up to the expectations that the production sets right off the bat. It's very orchestral. The first few seconds of Introvert are just absolutely magnificent, and they really show you what you're getting into. And Simbi just kicks it in, and she fucking kills it. I think she's at her absolute best in her entire career here. Her flows are just infectious. Her songwriting is just pure poetry. She's so focused. Her level of confidence is just through the roof, even higher than it was on Grey Area, which it was already, she was already performing with a swagger and confidence on there. And it's one of the best albums I've heard this year. It's certainly the best hip hop album I've heard this year. And, sonically, I think this album is one of a kind. It just blends all the genres. It blends all the ideas together so seamlessly. Simbi is just at her best. Inflow just works magic. Everything clicks, and yeah, I definitely see this album going down as a classic. And Little Simz is honestly up there with Kendrick, with Kanye, as one of the best rappers in the game right now. And could you provide any better proof than this whole project? It's absolutely fantastic. It's a great album. It's one that I come back to regularly, and yeah, it's definitely a highlight for the year.
Hard fucking agree. And with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Sometimes I Might Be Introvert are Introvert, Woman, and Misunderstood. My least favourite track is I See You, and I gave this album a decent 9.
My favourite tracks are Introvert, Little Q Part 2, and Speed. I didn't really have any least favourite tracks. I gave this album a strong 8 out of 10.
Next, we have Senjutsu by Iron Maiden. This is the 17th studio album from one of the most iconic UK heavy metal bands of all time, Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden are back after 6 years of studio silence, and it's nice to hear new material from Iron Maiden. But I guess it would be a bit of an understatement to say that Iron Maiden are long past their peak. They're still capable of putting out good records, but to say that they are far past the days of amazing albums like Number of the Beast, Power Slave, and Somewhere in Time is a bit of an understatement. I was also not really sure about how I would feel about Senjutsu, given I wasn't that big on the singles, but I tried to remain optimistic. But unfortunately, I really don't think that Senjutsu is all that great, and to be honest, for me, it's probably one of Iron Maiden's weaker records. The band pretty much stuck to their guns and their usual sound on this album, doing what they do best, but unfortunately it's not at their best, since I feel like the sound of this album really drags it down. While on the surface the production may seem pretty fine, there's a lot of mixes on here, and there's some of them that are very muddy, and Bruce Dickinson's vocals feel very buried at times. And another thing that kind of bugs me about this album, I feel like Bruce vocally just isn't really on his A game here. He definitely sounds less impactful than he has before, and while his operatic style is still catchy on a few tracks here, you can definitely hear age getting to him. Also, I just feel like the band were really dragging out the songs in this album. Some of these songs are well over 10 minutes long, and some are even longer, and you can't help but feel like the band bloated out some of these tracks with a bit of filler to pad it out and not really add much interesting dynamically. I do like a few songs on here. There isn't a single Bruce Dickinson Maiden album which doesn't have a song that I at least like. But for me, those moments are few and far in between on Senjutsu, and the album as a whole just feels a little inconsistent. It might just be the weakest. It might, I don't know, I guess I'd have to take this into consideration, and I don't want to spoil anything because we have a little Iron Maiden worst to best coming up. But for what it's worth, it could have been worse, but alas, it's just an okay effort from the band.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Iron Maiden releasing their 17th studio album isn't something I was looking forward to with just absolute optimism. I was expecting something serviceable, and I got something serviceable. Nothing less, nothing more. Senjutsu, for the most part, just feels like a bit of heavy metal pastiche from a band that's, as you said, way past their prime. The guitar work is fine, but often just kind of blends into the background. The drumming and bass just kind of do their job, nothing more. And Bruce Dickinson, I mean, it's still Bruce Dickinson, but he certainly sounded a lot better in the past. I still think the band has the occasional standout track in them. But for the most part, standout is far from what I would describe this entire album as. It's solid, but nothing more.
Yep. My favourite tracks from Senjutsu are Writing on the Wall and Days of Future Past. My least favourite track is Death of the Celts and The Parchment, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite tracks are Lost in a Lost World and Darkest Hour. My least favourite track is The Parchment, and I give this album a strong 5.
Next we have Mercury, Act 1 by Imagine Dragons. This is the 5th studio album from the infamous Nevada pop rock band Imagine Dragons. Now, Imagine Dragons have slowly but surely become one of the most hated bands in modern music, and there's many factors that play into that, most of which I absolutely agree with, since the band's music is just some of the most obnoxious, overblown, overproduced, and annoying pop music that I've ever heard. So with that in mind, I was just not excited to hear this new album. I hated the teaser tracks for it, and wouldn't you know, I didn't like the album after giving it a listen. Now, I don't think it's a terrible album, or as terrible as some of the band's most recent albums like Evolve and Origins, and it does feel like a more respectable effort from them, given some of the ideas and that they tried to incorporate, and the fact that it's a tad bit more listenable than their previous stuff, but for the most part, the tracks range from just incredibly mediocre to just downright unlistenable. The album itself is, once again, very overproduced. The production all over this album is the same typical overblown shite that the band have made previously, while at the same time it has moments that are just so overly sterile and bland. Dan Reynolds vocally is still absolutely atrocious, and his songwriting is just often just super corny. The general sounds and presentation of this thing is absolutely generic, and I don't have much of a reason to remember a single note or melody from this thing when it just sounds so atrocious. I have nothing more to say about it. It's just a new Imagine Dragons album. What do you expect?
The general consensus thrown around is that, this is the best Imagine Dragons album in a while, and while, sure, that also, it's like saying, this episode of Big Bang Theory is way better than the last few. It's like, what the fuck does that mean? It means nothing. In fact, it's got like 2 good tracks, and those are the only thing that keep it from being the worst fucking thing they've ever released. The track My Life, I think, is well produced, and it's powerful, even if at times it's a little overbearing, and the track Dull Knives honestly just kind of kicks ass. But then everything else on this project ranges from unremarkable to just absolutely fucking terrible. There's a lot that stands out as particularly bad. But instead of wasting too much time talking about an Imagine Dragons album, I'll just say that, the screaming vocals on moments on this are probably the most unintentionally hilarious thing I've heard all year. It just does not work. Does not work for them. Yeah, and I hope I never have to hear that shit again.
Likewise. My favourite track from Mercury Act 1 is Easy Come Easy Go. My least favourite tracks are Dull Knives and Cutthroat especially. That song is fucking terrible, and I gave this album a light 3.
My favourite tracks are My Life and Dull Knives. My least favourite tracks are Monday, Giants, and Cutthroat. Fucking one of the worst songs of the year. And I give this album a light 3 out of 10.
Next up we have Star-Crossed by Kacey Musgraves. This is the 5th studio album from the Texas singer-songwriter Kacey Musgraves. This album is also coming out 3 years after her last album, Golden Hour, which is her most critically acclaimed and loved record, if I remember correctly, but I still have to listen to that album. And Star-Crossed is the first bit of Kacey Musgraves that I'm hearing, so yeah, it's out now. I've had the opportunity to give it a listen, and I can safely say that Star-Crossed is a decent record all in all. Where the album shines the most for me is in a lot of the songwriting, which is, tackling the main topics of divorce and heartbreak. Sure, there's some corny moments here, and I don't know, they're just, I guess, what am I even saying here? Never mind. Yeah, there's some corny moments here and there, but I feel like Kacey does a really good job to get her message across in a way that's both striking and simple. It works effectively well to her advantage on this album, and the songwriting even shines on the tracks I don't really care a whole lot for. Then we tackle the production, when we tackle the production end of things, it's a very competently produced record. The sound of this album does feel pretty eclectic with influences from folk pop, psychedelic pop, and contemporary R&B. And for what it's worth, there's some incredibly stellar moments on this album, like the intro track, which is, for lack of better words, just fucking fantastic. But my main problem with the album is that it's just pleasant. That's all it really is. It's just a pleasant album through and through. It certainly has its main highlights and fantastic tracks, but I just can't help but feel like these songs don't really have too much memorable going on for them. Some of them just feel way too breezy and feel very samey. The songwriting is still good, but I can't help but feel like the squeaky clean production can just render these tracks into nothing more than just kind of fine, lifeless pop tunes. I don't have anything else to say about Star-Crossed apart from the fact that it's a well-written album, but it just falls flat and leaving a huge impact on me because of its often like too clean production.
Star-Crossed sees Kacey, explore a kind of new direction for her. She explores a more psychedelic and synthy approach to her country pop style, and overall, I think it does show some potential. It does work quite well, and at times it delivers some of her finest moments to date. However, I still feel like maybe she isn't quite comfortable in the style because it is kind of playing it safe a lot of the time. It's not really the most exciting album, even if it means, a bit of a new direction for Kacey. Overall, it doesn't really show us anything, that no previous artist has ever done before. It's pleasant, it's nice, it's well produced, but for lack of a better word, it's very safe. However, in general, I still think that, Kacey definitely proves that there's more to her than, just fitting inside the bubbles that she's set for herself previously. And I think that her desire to try new things, to take her sound to new directions can only be a good thing going forward. However, I don't think it quite hits the mark here, even if, overall, still a solid album, still has some highlights, but it feels like a baby step towards a more fleshed out direction.
Yeah, my favourite tracks from Star-Crossed are the title track, Good Wife, and If This Was a Movie. My least favourite track is What Doesn't Kill Me, and I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Cherry Blossom, Simple Times, and Breadwinner. My least favourite track is Keep Looking Up, and I gave this album a light 6 out of 10.
Next we have Hey Wash by Low. This is the 13th studio album from the Minnesota slowcore band Low. Now once again I find myself in a situation where I've never heard anything from a certain band that seems to have been around for a very long time, and I'm starting with their newest record. Low being the band, of course, and with this new album here, Hey Wash, which is coming out 3 years after their last record, I wasn't sure as to what to expect because, quite frankly, I did know nothing about this band when going into it. And after I gave it a listen, I can safely say that I do like what the band manages to pull off sonically on a surface level. And I can certainly get behind the ideas going into each track, but for the most part, I just think it's decent. The ideas and interesting dynamics are absolutely there within this album's runtime. I like the way that the band pulls together some incredibly atmospheric and ambient influences with this kind of droney industrial sound. I also appreciate the band's sense of pop melody on this album as well, since the vocal lines and soaring nature of the sounds hit particularly well and blend nicely with each other. Plus, it has some really fantastic tracks to its name, like the opener, which is just so great. But to be honest, the main thing that really bugs me about this album is the fact that the pacing of the tracks are just way too slow. I get it, they're a slowcore band, it's in the name for fuck's sakes, but I just couldn't find much of anything to hold on to when it came to the dronier sounds, and there wasn't really much interesting going on with the band, with what they were doing. It's kind of like that new Alexis Marshall album, except it's listenable. So yeah, I have nothing else to say. It's certainly got artistic merit, and I do like a fair amount about it, but as a whole, it just falls flat for me with how it paces itself.
I haven't heard that much material from Low. I've obviously heard their 1994 album, which I forget the title of, but it's an amazing album. And I've listened to their last few projects, and they definitely have hinted towards a more industrial, more glitchy, direction on their previous record, Double Negative. But that album, while enjoyable, just wasn't quite there. wasn't quite there in terms of refinement and the cohesion that I usually expect from Low. On Hey What, I don't think there's any beating around the bush. I think Low jump right into a sound they've been hinting at and just deliver a full-on, glitchy, noisy, post-industrial experience. And, it proves to be a really exciting direction for the band, and it's definitely an exciting addition to their catalogue. Never has industrial noise sounded so serene and heavenly and gorgeous, and the production, overall is just very pristine. And at the same time, it still knows how to deliver its punches and also knows when to deliver its punches. Instrumentally, it's very eclectic. It's, very cohesively assembled. The noise, the industrial fucking soundscapes, the dream pop, the everything, they're just all put into one bubble, and it all, works better than it probably should have at times. It's a lot of these ambient too. A lot of these are genres that typically, aren't grouped together, but I think Low make a sound that is like truly their own, and they combine everything seamlessly. It's definitely a very good project throughout, and again, it's an exciting direction for the band. I do adore, their shoegaze slowcore roots, but they can make some fantastic stuff in this style down the line. And after decades at this point of releasing music in that kind of shoegazy slowcore style, a change of pace is definitely respectable.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks from Hey What are White Horses, I Can't Wait, and Days Like These. My least favourite track is There's a Comma After Still, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks are Hey, Days Like These, and The Price You Pay. My least favourite track is There's a Comma After Still, and I give this album a decent 7 out of 10.
Next up, we have The Melodic Blue by Baby Keem. This is the debut album from California rapper, producer, songwriter, and Kendrick Lamar's cousin, Baby Keem. Now, Baby Keem is coming out with this new album after he broke into the rap scene with his second mixtape entitled Die For My Bitch, which for me was a very good mixtape that showed that Baby Keem had some potential to be a truly standout figure in the current wave of oversaturated trap rap alongside, the likes of Carti and Travis Scott, who, managed to carve out their own sounds, so much so that other rappers are now copying them. I was a bit iffy about this album, though, during the lead up to its release, since I felt like all the singles just weren't that great, except for a couple. I was kind of underwhelmed by a couple of them, especially the one with had the Kendrick feature. I'm trying to remember what it was called. But, I enjoyed one of the singles, obviously, so there's that. But there's also a couple of singles that, he teased earlier on in the year that didn't make it onto the album, which is a shame, because I did like the song No Sense. But anyways, I went into this album hoping for the best, and I'm pretty indifferent towards the Melodic Blue, personally. Now, it's not bad or just a downright awful album for me, but I just felt like there just wasn't enough going on with what Baby Keem was trying to explore here, since a lot of the execution was either basic, boring, or obnoxious. There are some tracks that I do really fuck with, like, I get behind some of the bangers, like the opening track especially, which is just a fucking brilliant start to the album. But then it turns into a bit of a downhill, uphill battle after that, which is not fun, to say the least. Well, there's diversity in what Keem tries to achieve on here, but a lot of the time they just aren't all that interesting or immediate. It just seems way too substanceless and basic. There's a lot of beats on this thing that just have nothing stand out about them. There's very little to latch onto in terms of the core tracks. I feel like Baby Keem's kind of weird inflections can be very hit or miss, and either annoying or boring. And I just felt like the odd creative choices he makes on here don't really suit him. Keem can definitely add some energy to a track, but often than not, the beats and his performances are what hold him back, since he has nothing interesting to say or just has nothing interesting to add to the very low-key tracks especially. The Kendrick features are certainly the features of all time, and I like what Travis and Don Toliver did in their respective tracks. So yeah, I don't have much else to say about this new Baby Keem album, except that I expected better, but unfortunately he failed to deliver on this album. It has its highlights, but for what it's worth, it's just fine.
Yeah, this new Baby Keem album is for me, the epitome of inconsistency. Baby Keem is talented, and, when in the right environment, on the right track, he has a lot of potential, and a lot of that potential does bleed through onto this album. But for every good track on this project, we get another track that just completely misses the mark, oftentimes in every single way. There's some moments here that either just don't feel finished at all. There's moments that, seem finished, but the direction just doesn't suit, Keem's style at all. And there's other moments where Keem just kind of seems a little directionless and just resorts to some very boilerplate stuff. However, that being said, I think the good material here is still worth sitting through the rubbish for. But, honestly, it's not an album that I would come back to. It's also not an album that I, felt I wasted my time listening to. It's just, meh.
Yeah. My favourite tracks from the Melodic Blue are Trademark USA, Durag Activity, and Vent. My least favourite track would probably have to be... the track Pink Panties grew on me because the hook is fucking hilarious to me. If I had to pick a least favourite, it would probably be Range Brothers, and I gave this album a strong 5.
My favourite tracks are Trademark USA, Family Ties, and Scars. My least favourite tracks are Pink Panties, South Africa, and Lost Souls, and I give this album a strong 4.
Next up, we have By the Time I Get to Phoenix by Injury Reserve. This is the sophomore album from the Arizona experimental hip-hop and hardcore hip-hop group Injury Reserve. This album was highly anticipated for a lot of people as of late, myself included, but a lot of my anticipation quickly turned into skepticism because the singles for this album hinted at them going in a very odd direction, to say the least. It's been 2 years since their last record, and I'm sure this isn't news to anyone who knows about Injury Reserve, but in that space of time, it was announced that Steppa J. Groggs had passed away. So, no one was really sure if we would ever get another Injury Reserve album ever again. But alas, it's here now, and as expected, it's garnered massive critical acclaim from fans, and it's, become one of the highest rated albums of 2020, to say the least. But where do I sit with the record? Well, I had to sit with it a fair amount. I sat with the album for a good 5 listens, I would say. And now that I think about it, I think that By the Time I Get to Phoenix is a great album. It's not one of my absolute favourite Injury Reserve projects, but it's easily one of the most interesting and unique records in the group's discography, in my opinion. Now, I shit you not when I say that By the Time I Get to Phoenix was probably one of the hardest albums that I've ever decided to rate or review, because to put it bluntly, I just had no fucking idea about whether I liked it or not, or how I even could describe this thing. Thankfully, though, I listened to it more and I ended up getting a better understanding of what I was listening to. And as a result, I really grew to enjoy this project. But, for what it is, I think that it's one of the finest statements that Injury Reserve have ever made. Uniqueness doesn't automatically make something good. It definitely helps. But for me, that doesn't matter when the music just doesn't connect with me. Honestly, that was my initial mentality towards this album. But, one morning I was just on my way to college. I decided to give it another listen, and wouldn't you know, it clicked hard. And when I say hard, I mean it. By the Time I Get to Phoenix is just absolutely surreal from front to back. It's just filled to the brim with some of the most dense, disorienting, might I add, and cathartic material that Injury Reserve have ever made. It's clear that Injury Reserve I feel like they're trying to capture the feeling of grief throughout this album's duration. It's melodically dissonant, it's structurally chaotic, and it's oddly psychedelic. It manages to feel so disorienting and fractured, while at the same time just feeling cohesive in a way, in the way that it flows and what it tries to do sonically. The glitchy psychedelia on this album is just so off the wall. It's so weird. The way it structures itself is unique. I'm even struggling to think of a hip-hop album that shares any resemblance to this thing. Either way, I feel like the individual tracks are fantastic, and Parker Corey's production is just composed and produced well. Richie's performances are certainly one of the weirdest aspects of this album if we take the production out of context, since half the time it doesn't really feel like Richie is trying to rap, but more so just rhythmically ramble his just introspective yet cryptic thoughts and whatever comes to his mind. He even tries to get a bit more melodic here and there, but for the most part it sounds dissonant. And for me, both of these modes suit what's going on sonically. Groggs is on this album a few times, as far as I could tell, and those moments are ones to savor, since they're just easily some of the most chilling and compelling on the album for me. With all the positives in mind, I do have a few minor negatives. For one, there's 2 noticeable low points in the album. These tracks especially just don't really do much to stand out as anything memorable or cathartic when compared to the rest of the album, and they just come off as bit more bland and uninteresting. And my other main criticism is that I think it's going to be one of those cases where it'll be a rare moment when I decide to re-listen to this thing. Other Injury Reserve projects thrive off their relative replay value and enjoyability, whereas by the time I get to Phoenix, comes off like one of those albums that I can only really listen to when I'm actually like properly in the mood for. That's really it. I don't really have too much to say besides that. I've rambled on enough about it. I think it's great. Sonically, it's one of the group's weirdest and most experimental projects today. It's certainly one of the weirdest ones. It does give off a feeling of catharsis. I much prefer other Injury Reserve projects, but for what it's worth, by the time I get to Phoenix, will go down as an important moment for them, and it's a wonderful tribute to the late Groggs, in my opinion. So rest in peace, Groggs.
Rest in peace, Groggs. Honestly, this is an album that I have a bit of a hard time talking about because there's really no like comparisons I can make to any other artists or any other albums or any other tracks even. There's just, all the material I hear on this album just sounds completely unique and just completely fresh and completely new. And, that in of itself is just quite the feat. But I'll say here, I do really like this album. I honestly didn't at first, but I definitely came around to it as well. But I don't really hold it on the same level that I know a lot of people do. I think it's a very good album, but I'm not completely blown away and in love by it. Releasing a project in 2021 that sounds like nothing I've heard before is definitely a compliment. I do like when an artist can just step out of their comfort zone in a way that doesn't also derive from any other artists or anything that came before them. I think what Injury Reserve I almost said Injury Reserve do here is just they're in a league of their own. They're doing stuff that is coming from them, and it doesn't feel inspired by anything in particular. It feels like it definitely takes aspects from a lot of different things and puts them together in a very idiosyncratic way. And that in itself is just definitely worth checking out this album for. Every single track you can dissect layer by layer and you'd still have a hard time figuring out what's what and finding anything familiar to put your finger on. It's really amazing how densely packed this album is of just unique ideas, unique sounds. Everything on this project is just one of a kind. But crucially for how completely unique and unlike anything else this project is, it also, to me personally, has isn't as consistently enjoyable as it is consistently fascinating. There's plenty of moments here that, certainly feel groundbreaking, but just don't really stick the landing for me. It's a project that undoubtedly paints Injury Reserve as one of the most unpredictable and exciting groups, in the genre of hip-hop today. And, after the cloud of unpredictability clears, I think not every track on this album is that memorable or that enjoyable, but there are certainly a lot of moments, and I mean a lot of moments, where everything just sounds so mesmerizing and fantastic that I cannot help to take my hat off to Injury Reserve for this project. But overall, I think it's a very good album. It's a must listen in my opinion, but it's not one that I'm absolutely head over heels for.
Alright, my favourite tracks from By the Time I Get to Phoenix are Superman That, Footwork in the Forest Fire, Postpartum and Knees. My least favourite tracks are Ground Zero and Smoke Don't Clear, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favourite tracks are Outside, Superman That, and Knees. My least favourite tracks are Ground Zero and Top Picks for You, and I gave this album a decent 7 out of 10.
Next up, we have Montero by Lil Nas X. This is the full-length debut album from Georgia rapper, singer, and certified hitmaker Lil Nas X. To say that Lil Nas X has had a very prolific past couple of years since the blow-up of Old Town Road would be a bit of an understatement, since the guy has been dropping popular single after popular single, making conservative dickheads mad in the best way possible. And he proved time and time again that the way he markets himself and his personality is just truly genius. Also, it's just so weird to think that Old Town Road came out like 3 years ago. And then I thought he'd be a one-hit wonder, but, look where we are now. Montero is his debut, and I was pretty hyped to hear this record since the singles for it were so good. And after giving it a listen, I can safely say that I really like what I'm hearing on Montero. To get my main negatives that I have with the project out of the way first, I think that it has a few tracks that aren't all that memorable or great. They're not bad tracks by any means, but I just feel like these tracks specifically have the weakest performances, the least amount of personality, the weakest production, and they're just not all that memorable. Thankfully though, those moments are only few and far in between, because I think that Montero has plenty of quality to its name. For one, this album is just chock full of tracks that display Lil Nas X's personality, but also cater to his more personal and sincere side. The polished production is often quite infectious and pretty versatile. We get helpings of some pop, rap, trap, but then there's more pop rock and ballad-esque sounds on here. I think that what Lil Nas X has going on here is really good, and his guests managed to do a really good job performance-wise. Lil Nas X has the charisma and attitude to keep these tracks together and just well thought out. And as a whole, I took away a lot from the really fun and infectious tracks on this album, like Industry Baby, for example, which is, that's a banger. I also will always appreciate the moments where he gets a little more personal. So yeah, as a whole, I really like Montero. I think that it's a really good pop project, and it's a very good debut from Lil Nas X. It's flawed, yes, but I feel like the album has enough really good material to keep me satisfied, and I think that it has some of his best tracks to date on here. So yeah, shit slaps, and it's the best helping of mainstream pop that I've heard in a good while.
There's a lot that Lil Nas X's music does right for me. The charisma, the individuality, and the talent is certainly there, but all that I think doesn't really make up at times for the redundancy and the lack of really any interesting new ideas on a lot of these tracks. For every track where Lil Nas X ideas comes to life perfectly and everything clicks, his personality shines through. There's another track which just to me feels like kind of overdone pop rap with slightly more character than most other pop rap. But still, musically it just doesn't really display, anything I haven't heard before. But the fact that Lil Nas X is very young, he's already branched out to so many different things and tried so many different new styles and new ideas. It's definitely a sign of good things to come, and, his progression as an artist is certainly far from over, in my opinion. It's just from start to finish, this project just does not feel that significant to me. It feels again like a stepping stone towards some greater things, and largely on this album, I think Lil Nas X's personality to me is a little more likable than musically any of the aspects of some of these tracks. However, I mean, tracks like Montero or Void are just bangers for sure. So yeah, I'm kind of on the fence on this album. It has its moments, it has some poor moments, but overall, it's just not blowing me away.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks from Montero are Montero, Call Me By Your Name, Dead Right Now, Industry Baby, and Void. My least favourite track is Scoop, and I gave this album a light 7.
My favourite tracks are Montero, Sun Goes Down, and Void. My least favourite track is Scoop, and I gave this album a decent 5 out of 10.
Alright, next up we have Eternal Blue by Spiritbox. This is the debut album from Canadian alternative metal and metalcore band Spiritbox. Now, in the metal community, there's been a lot of hype building up around this band, and particularly this debut. It's been getting positive reviews all around from critics and listeners alike, so seeing all the positive buzz around this album was exciting, to say the least, and I was very curious to see what the hype was about. Well, after listening to this thing twice, I can safely say that it's a decent helping of melodic metalcore and alternative metal, but for what it's worth, I feel like it doesn't really offer much in the way of any fresh ideas or interesting executions of said ideas. For me, I just feel like what Spiritbox attempt to do on here just feels very indicative of a lot of sounds and ideas that a lot of djenty metalcore bands seem to be thriving on, particularly Architects, but to be honest, they did an Architects better than Architects did this year. So, Spiritbox often just play things fairly safe and don't really deviate from these sounds. With that all being said, there are some things that I can appreciate this album for. For one, I feel like the performances from the the band are very solid. There's some really solid riffs. Despite the production being a bit polished, it sounds decent. Courtney LaPlante's vocals sound really good. She does a really good job at what she's given, and her screamed vocals are pretty solid too. And, there's some really great tracks to be found in this album. I do find it a bit generic and inconsistent, but it had some highlights for sure. There's definitely more work to be done, but Spiritbox do show a bit of potential on their debut, and I hope that potential can be reached. We'll just have to wait and see for now.
Yeah, honestly, alternative metal and especially gent aren't always my cup of tea. I do find that some of the music in that style is rather grating and certainly unmemorable. And Eternal Blue definitely has some of that, but there's also definitely a lot more character and just overall a lot more to this project than, an unremarkable alt metal pastiche fest. It combines the sounds of, the aforementioned genres with a very atmospheric and ethereal production style, which, in my opinion, definitely elevates a lot of these tracks, and, it definitely adds something fresh to the mix. But, overall, I mean, it's still at its core a very kind of run-of-the-mill metal album with just some interesting, ideas and directions there. However, I do think that those ideas and those directions aren't to be, skimmed over. They definitely do elevate the music quite a bit. And also, Courtney's LaPlante's vocals are consistently very solid. And overall, it's solid. It's solid. And solid is probably, a compliment when it comes to my opinions on gent overall. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah. My favourite tracks from Eternal Blue are Hurt You, Holy Roller, and Constance. My least favourite track is Eternal Blue, and I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Sunkiller, Holy Roller, and Constance. My least favourite track is We Live in a Strange World, and I gave this album a light 6.
Next up, we have Torn Arteries by Carcass. This is the 7th studio album from the Liverpool melodic death metal band Carcass. Carcass have returned after 8 years of studio silence, but, recently I did a little dive into their discography, and I do enjoy it a fair amount, but, there's only really one album that blew me away. I got introduced to Carcass when we did our Death Metal Essentials, which we covered their album Heartworks, which is a very influential melodic death metal album. But, enough about the past, we're into the present, and it's time to talk about this new album here, Torn Arteries. Going into it, I was a bit skeptical since I felt like it was just going to be one of those albums from an older metal band that just fails to be something noteworthy. But Torn Arteries caught me off guard because it's surprisingly good. I do feel like it starts a bit slow, however, but the first few tracks are pretty decent, mind you, but there were only a few on that half that were noteworthy. But after track 5, the album picks up heavily, and for lack of better words, I just think it's fucking killer onward. Carcass's sound is pretty much updated to fit the modern age, since it has this very pristine modern polish to it, and while it does sound a bit unbalanced on a few tracks here, I don't have much of an issue with it besides that, since I still think it sounds really good and the performances from the band are really solid. The growled vocals are really gnarly, and I like the way the kind of snarl that they have going on. The guitar work is great, there's some really solid dynamics in the instrumentals, the riffs are great, the solos are solid, and the tracks on here are just really fucking fun when they're at their best. Carcass's sound is a bit more expansive with the longer song structures, but generally speaking, I think it has, it's not that different from their usual sound, but hey, it has so many slappers on it, so I don't care. So yeah, this was a pleasant surprise from Carcass. Torn Arteries is a really good helping of melodic death metal from the band, even if it's a little flawed. It has some killer tracks to its name, and all in all, good job, lads. I'm glad to see the quality is there.
On Torn Arteries, I don't think Carcass really surprise or tread new ground, but instead we get a band that's just playing to their strengths and just creating some memorable death metal goodness along the way. I think that, for a band, again, just like Maiden, past their prime, playing to their strengths is certainly what's expected a lot of the time. A lot of bands either do that or just completely go balls to the walls with some weird new ideas, and that method is always a little more rewarding, but also 20 million times more risky. However, Carcass have long been a pioneer in death metal, specifically melodic death metal, and while there's certainly nothing being pioneered on here, Torn Arteries is still a showcase of a band that still has some focus, some of the energy, and a lot of the intensity that they had in their earlier years. I mean, if you enjoy death metal, if you enjoy Carcass, definitely check this out, because it is a very solid helping. Don't let the album cover fool you. It's really a solid project. It's not blowing me away on us. Like, it's definitely flawed, as you said, but it's definitely a surprising album, because I honestly wholeheartedly thought this was going to be a nightmare to sit through.
The covers indicate that, huh?
Yeah, the cover and a death metal band like 20 years past their prime. 20 more.
Fuck. Nah, dude. I think I've seen like videos where people were unboxing like their vinyl like issues of this, and I think it comes with like a fucking plate that has that like veggie heart in it, and with a knife and fork. I think it's funny. It's smart marketing, but hey.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Torn Arteries are Flesh Ripping Sonic Torment, Kelly's Meat Emporium, Wake Up and Smell the Carcass, KV Emptor, and my least favorite track is Eleanor Rigor Mortis, which is probably one of the worst like Beatles reference song titles I've ever seen, and I gave this album a light 7.
My favorite tracks are Torn Arteries, Flesh Ripping Torment Limited, Wake Up and Smell the Carcass. My least favorite track is also Eleanor Rigor Mortis.
Fuck's sake. Alright, next up we have Black Encyclopedia of the Air by Moor Mother. This is the 12th album from American poet, rapper, wordsmith, and activist Moor Mother. I've been familiar with Moor Mother since January of this year, I believe, thanks to her last record, Brass, with Billy Woods, which is a really great album in my opinion, lyrically and production-wise. It was very challenging and dense, and it was a really interesting and unique record that I really loved the hell out of, and I was pretty interested in what Moor Mother would put together on her next LP, and I've heard it now, and despite some impressive lyrics and cool sonic change-ups, I personally find it to be a bit inconsistent in quality and in memorability. Lyrically, once again, Moor Mother, fails to fall flat on any track here. She very much sticks to the themes and ideas that she normally explores, like Afrofuturism, so on that front, the album really excels. Not to mention, I really like her spoken word and sort of broken flow, if that makes sense. It really fits the kind of like abstract vibe she goes for, and I fuck with it. Sonically, this album sees Moor Mother go in a direction that feels a lot more mellow, synthetic, and somewhat ambient. It does feel a little more accessible in contrast with her more jagged and out there sound, and for a lot of the tracks on here that I liked, I felt like it works well and I'm enjoying it, but despite all the positives, I just have a few grievances with the album. For one, I just feel like after the first half of the track list, the album just gets a little bit one-dimensional and a bit predictable. Plus, given how mellow and synthetic it is, I feel like it gets a little boring and kind of sleep-inducing. She does go for more ambitious structures too, but I don't think that they're all that interesting, and they don't do much for me personally. I do like a lot of tracks from this album though, so that's a bonus, but I wish that I could have enjoyed the whole thing a lot more than I actually did, but hey, it's whatever. I think that this album is solid. It definitely excels lyrically, but when it comes to the shift in sonic direction and overall enjoyability, it could have been better.
Yeah, I will never deny Moor Mother's talent, nor will I say I don't see the intrigue in the music and in the sound. But she has yet to really blow me away with an album, and with something that to me is just truly cohesive and consistently enjoyable. But if anything, Black Encyclopedia of the Air kind of feels like a step back. I definitely won't deny, the weight to a lot of the lyrics. The weight is certainly there. The songwriting is where this project excels, in my opinion. However, the delivery just doesn't really do anything for me. It sounds a little too mellow, a little too quiet. There's no punchiness, no focus. And when blended with the equally mellow and just quiet, for lack of a better word, production, the album just feels kind of sluggish at times. It feels kind of hollow. and it just doesn't really click with me. It's far from unlistenable, but it's also equally far from memorable. I think the highlights are few and far in between, and overall, I mean, I do see the appeal in Moor Mother's music, but as I said, this certainly feels like a step back for me personally.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Black Encyclopedia of the Air are Vera Hall, Shakira and Mangrove. My least favorite tracks are Nighthawk of Time, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favorite track is Rogue Waves. My least favorite track is Clock Fight, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
We're moving on to our final batch of albums here, and we're going to kick that off with A Beginner's Mind by Sufjan Stevens and Angelo de Augustine. This is the latest collaborative effort from indie folk singer-songwriters Sufjan Stevens and Angelo de Augustine. This record was a bit of an unexpected one since I had no idea that it was coming out around the corner, and as far as I'm aware, Sufjan was just fresh off of releasing like 5 ambient albums this year. So I didn't expect a new album to be out so soon, and it's a collaboration too, so that'll be interesting to see. When it comes to both artists, I'm more familiar with Sufjan than I am Angelo. I've never heard Angelo's work at all, but aside from just the few projects that I've heard from Sufjan Stevens, I do like The Ascension the most. I'm not too blown away by his work though. I've still have yet to be like just hit with that wave of like, oh fuck, this is amazing, I hoped it would be good at the very least, but, surprise, surprise, it's very good indeed. In many ways, Beginner's Mind is kind of what you'd expect to hear from Sufjan. It's very much residing in indie folk, but at the same time, it feels a bit more dense and a bit more ethereal. Once again, the beauty shines through on a Sufjan-related project, and the songwriting, once again, is absolutely stellar. The concept is pretty interesting for what it is, and I think it's done well. Vocally, I think Sufjan and Angelo do a very good job and add a ton to the ethereal nature of the tracks, and the highlights on here are fantastic. There's some brilliant tracks to be found in this thing, and they're ones that'll guarantee to just leave you in awe. My main issue with the album, though, is that I couldn't tell when Angelo was singing. I might just be dumb or deaf or, not being able to tell, but I just couldn't. He sounds so much like Sufjan that it's scary as shit. Either way, though, the songs are great, and I enjoy them, even if, some don't blow me away. So yeah, I think it's a really good album. I don't have too much to say about it. It's a good Sufjan Angelo de Augustine project. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really uncanny. I think it's only on the second listen that I was like, oh, they're both singing. I thought Angelo de Augustine was just, I don't know, doing the production or the instrumentation. I didn't know.
Same. It was just like, wait, who is this now? Is he a producer? Is he a songwriter? I'm just like, what's going on? I just couldn't tell. All I could hear was Sufjan. That was all I could hear. Like,
yeah. Well, I mean, one of my biggest points with this album is just the the chemistry and how well the two gel together. And if anything, that's just a testament to that. Yeah, Sufjan and Angelo really present one of the most gorgeous and serene albums of the year. With Beginner's Mind, it's an album that is just cathartically beautiful. It's a very lush display of some of the most notable material that Sufjan has released in years. And, while I am completely new to the work of Angelo de Augustine, I think, as I said, the two click rather seamlessly. They definitely complement each other in a way that is just truly fantastic. It sounds like Sufjan's doing his own backing vocals at times. No, it's honestly though, it's just the chemistry is definitely there. I think the instrumentation is just lush. It's fantastic. It's serene, and it's definitely a truly pleasant experience from start to finish. Even though, admittedly, it doesn't present that much variety in its sound throughout the album. But even though it doesn't really change things up that much, I don't think it overstays its welcome with its runtime, and I don't think it ever fails to just enchant and hypnotize with just its serene soundscapes. Overall, it's a great album.
Yeah, my favourite tracks from A Beginner's Mind are Back to Oz, This Is the Thing, and Lady Macbeth in Chains. My least favourite track is Murder and Crime, and I gave this album a strong 7.
My favourite tracks are Reach Out, Lady Macbeth in Chains, and Olympia. My least favorite tracks are, well, my least favorite track is the Pillar of Souls, not sounds. And I give this album a decent 7 out of 10.
Alright, next up we have Flux by Poppy. This is the fourth studio album from Massachusetts pop singer-songwriter Poppy. In recent years, Poppy has shown herself to be a very versatile and varied artist in her field, since she recently decided to ditch the pure bubblegum pop sound of her older work in favour of a more industrial and alt-metal approach with her last album, I Disagree. You know, she's still sticking to the pop aspects, but her blends of these sounds, in my opinion, worked well in her last album, which I really liked as a whole, and I really fuck with her most recent EP as well, which also kind of brought in elements of nu metal, which is pretty interesting, and they're very fresh. Yeah, well, a new album is out now. I was interested in hearing what Poppy was going to do next, and while I don't really enjoy it as much as I Disagree, I still think it's an admirable artistic change of pace for Poppy. Now, for one, this album doesn't exactly feel as metallic in presentation, unlike I Disagree. It feels more oriented in a sound that sits in a more alternative rock lane alongside elements of other sounds and styles like pop rock, dream pop, and at one point new wave, which kind of feels New Order inspired. The metal aspects are definitely there at times, but they aren't as present or as prominent as they were previously. It kind of feels reminiscent of a lot of grunge-like sounds and styles from kind of like the early scene. It kind of reminds me of that in some respects. And there's a couple of tracks that are fantastic, but despite that, I feel like Flux is flawed in many ways. Personally, I'm not really a fan of the production as a whole. It's definitely pleasant, but for the polished sound and modern presentation, it doesn't really lend itself well to what Poppy is trying to do on here, since I feel like there isn't much punch behind, the drums or the guitars. The more atmospheric and shoegazy tracks are definitely done well, but the more rock-driven stuff could have been done way better. Also, I just feel like a couple of the hooks and vocals and the verses just leave a lot to be desired. These select tracks just fall flat for me, and they aren't as catchy or as well executed as I'd like. So yeah, I do think that this is a decent album and it's artistically viable, but there's definitely a lot to appreciate and enjoy. But for me, I just feel like it could have been done way better than how it is currently.
Honestly, in my opinion, this new Poppy album is easily the highlight of her fascinating career so far, and it's one of my favorite albums of the year. It sees her take her, it sees her take her sound in a full on alternative rock / noise pop direction, and it just, for me, it just clicks. It just works. Every track on this project is just entirely unique, and stylistically it presents just entirely different ideas to the track before it. Yet rather than sounding just disjointed, each track just clicks into place to create one of the most, satisfying and dense 30 minutes of music I've heard all year. It really doesn't have any disappointing moments to me, and I think every idea that Poppy explores on here, she commits to fully. She puts her heart and soul into it, and comes out with definitely her most satisfying project to date. It's wonderfully infectious. I just cannot get enough of the noisy production. It's just perfect, and it's equal parts sentimental and raw and aggressive. As I said, it's one of my favorite albums of the year so far, and it's one that I know I won't see eye to eye with a lot of people on, but for me, this project is it's brilliant, and it's artistic high for Poppy.
Sheesh, that was unexpected. Fucking hell. Alright, my favourite tracks from Flux are Hysteria, Lessen the Damage, and Never Find My Place. The worst track is So Mean, and I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Flux, Hysteria, and Her, and I really don't have any of these favourite tracks. I gave this album a strong 8 out of 10.
Next, we have Lifeforms by Angels and Airwaves, and this is the last album that we're covering today. This is the 6th studio album from the California alternative rock band Angels and Airwaves. Now, prior to listening to this album, I've only really known Angels and Airwaves as Tom DeLonge's other band. Well, it's the main band now, since he's not in Blink anymore, and I never listened to anything from the band until this new album here. I wasn't sure as to what to expect from the band, and on this new album, I didn't really have any expectations for it, and after listening to it, I don't really get much from it. Now, Angels and Airwaves primarily reside in, the lane of energetic, pop-tinged alternative rock, and they do exactly that all over Lifeforms, and to be honest, I don't think much of it lands. I mean, it does have its fair share of catchy hooks and instrumentation, but as a whole, I just feel like it's really samey and very bland. The production comes off really sterile, the instrumentals aren't anything all too impressive, and Tom DeLonge's vocals have just not aged well from the days of Blink. Like, they don't sound very good, and the processing on some of them are just make them sound even worse. There isn't even a track that I would call good on this thing. In fact, I just find most of the tracks to be whatever, or just fine. Yeah, I don't have too much to say about it aside from that. It's just fine or whatever.
Yeah, for a band that Tom DeLonge has always kind of held close to his own heart, and the group's output in recent years has been rather inconsistent and also very much scarce. But the new long-awaited project is here, and it's just nothing to write home about at all. Don't get me wrong, it's certainly not all bad. I think instrumentally this album honestly has some magical moments, but one big thing that sticks out like a sore thumb throughout is what Tom presents here lyrically. I don't have much issue with Tom's vocals. I get they're bad, but also that's always been the case. That's kind of his signature charm. And that is still there. That is still present. And if that turned you away from his previous releases, then sure as fuck not going to enjoy this. But lyrically, this thing is just, it ranges from serviceable to just absolutely awkward and unbearable. The track Rebel Girl just makes me quite uncomfortable, and
Same.
No More Guns feels like an anti-gun track written by a 10-year-old. All in all, I mean, for fans of Tom or Blink, there's material on here that's worth checking out. But as a whole, it's not really a project which is, justifies how long people have waited for this project. And also, let's be real, Angels and Airwaves have the one song, and yeah.
I haven't heard the one song yet.
The Adventure.
Right. Yeah, is that it?
Yeah.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Lifeforms are Automatic and Restless Souls. The worst tracks are Rebel Girl and A Fire in a Nameless Town, and I gave this album a light 5.
My favourite tracks are Spellbound, Restless Souls, and Automatic. My least favourite tracks are No More Guns and Rebel Girl, and I gave this album a light 5.
Okay, we're going to move on to best songs of the month, worst albums, and best albums of the month now. So we're going to start off with the worst albums. We have 3 for these, and my number 3 pick is Lifeforms by Angels and Airwaves.
My number 3 pick is Baby Keem, Melodic Blue.
My number 2 is Certified Lover Boy by Drake.
My number 2 is Imagine Dragons, Mercury Act 1.
My number 1 is Mercury Act 1 by Imagine Dragons.
My number 1 is Drake, Certified Lover Boy.
The flip around good. Alright, now we're going to move on to the best albums of the month. My number 5 is Black Encyclopedia of the Air by Moor Mother.
My number 5 is Injury Reserve by The Time I Get to Phoenix.
My number 4 is Torn Arteries by Carcass.
My number 4 is Sufjan Stevens and Angelo de Augustine, Beginner's Mind.
My number 3 is A Beginner's Mind by Sufjan Stevens and Angelo de Augustine.
My number 3 is Low, Hey What.
My number 2 is By the Time I Get to Phoenix, Injury Reserve.
My number 2 is Poppy, Flux.
And we have the same number 1, I bet. Sometimes I Might Be Introvert, Little Simz.
Ditto.
Yes. Now we're going to move on to our best songs of the month segment. For my honorable mentions, I just want to mention Industry Baby by Lil Nas X, Knees by Injury Reserve, but my song of the month is Misunderstood by Little Simz.
I have a few highlights. Firstly, Sufjan Stevens and Angelo de Augustine, Lady Macbeth in Chains. Injury Reserve, Knees. Low, Days Like These. Little Simz, Introvert. Little Simz, Little Q Part 2. Poppy, Flux. But my favourite track of the month, I almost said year, is Her by Poppy.
Nice. Yeah. That's going to be it from us today. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's recap. I really hope that you enjoyed. What were some of your favourite albums of the month? What were some of your least favourite albums of the month? Please let us know. Of course, our necessary links will be in the description to the Cassette Tapes Discord server. You can chat with other people and get involved in the banter and the discourse. We also have our own YouTube channels and our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. And be sure to check out the next Worst to Best, which is going to be one on Iron Maiden. So that's going to be fun. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
See ya.
Peace.